Hey, I'm catiewahwah and you're watching The Record Review. Hey, this week I'm going to be reviewing Marika Hackman's gorgeously gothic new folk debut, We Slept at Last. The vinyl comes in a nice gatefold, and you also get an MP3 download code for a digital copy of the album. What's really cool is that you also get this 24-page booklet which sets the lyrics from the album amongst a specially commissioned photo set from Glenn Earler. They're absolutely beautiful, albeit in a weird, slightly uncanny way. Marika Hackman went to art school and is apparently a fan of Earler's work, saying that there's something mysterious about his photographs. The photos themselves are of Hackman posed as what appears to be a series of dumped bodies in the woods, tied up on beds, and even by a riverbank. They also seem to be influenced by another photographer, Sally Mann, and specifically her Body Farm series, which Hackman praised as giving decomposing bodies one last chance to look magnificent before they cease to exist in any recognizable form. I love that Hackman chose to complement her music with these works, and I think it adds a really interesting visual dimension to the album. Marika Hackman is a London-based singer-songwriter. She's usually called a folk artist, but there's a much darker, almost supernatural edge to her music compared to her contemporaries. She went to school with and actually formed her very first band with the model Cara Delevingne. In fact, the song Monday Afternoon on this album originally appeared in a Burberry campaign under a different name, Here I Lie, apparently thanks to Hackman's fashion connections. I first encountered Marika Hackman supporting the Antlers on tour last year, and I was just immediately drawn into and mesmerized by her storytelling. She's been gradually building up her credits, touring with Laura Marling, and also featuring as a guest vocalist on the Alt-J song Warm Foothills from This Is All Yours. Alt-J producer Charlie Andrew worked with Hackman on We Slept at Last, and they'd also previously worked together on Hackman's only other album released on vinyl, her 2013 EP, That Iron Taste. But she's been pretty prolific in her digital releases as well. Her EPs Covers, Sugar Blind, and Death Heat were all released over a 2-year period. And they're also all available to stream for free on her website, which I think is pretty cool. So Marika Hackman is really giving a darker edge to new folk. Especially compared to other new folk artists, she has a lot more of a gothic aesthetic, by which I mean that she has this real fascination with macabre imagery and gory scenarios. She juxtaposes very dark lyrics about death and decomposition over pretty melodies finger-picked on an acoustic guitar. A great example of this is in the song Monday Afternoon. It's only when you actually listen to the lyrics of this quite pretty song that you realize how disturbing it is. She's singing from the perspective of a dismembered body rotting in a forest. She's also quite open to experimentation in her work. She's spoken about using improvised instruments in the studio while she was producing this album, and she and Andrew have given each song quite a unique flavor on the album. In the song Open Wide, there's a Nirvana-style riff, which feels very different compared to the songs surrounding it. She also features guest vocals from Sivu, who's a really interesting artist, on her song Skin, and uses vocal samples on the song Undone Undress. She even has a Debussy-inspired lullaby on the album called Claude's Girl, which echoes back his classical compositions but in a new folk style. Her guitar is very precise and deliberate, almost mathematical like Debussy's compositions. But what really makes Hackman stand out to me is her superb storytelling, and I think that this is really important when we consider that she's a folk artist. One of the original purposes of folk music was to set stories and histories to tunes, so that people could teach them to each other and remember them better. So we should expect that the story should be pretty interesting. So I have read some critics saying that they don't think that this feels like a complete album. It doesn't follow one through story, it doesn't have enough definition between different songs. And I think that that might be because people were expecting to experience this album like a novel, like just one story. But personally, I found that the best way to approach the album is as a collection of short stories. It reminded me a lot of Regina Spektor's album Marianne Meets the Gravediggers. Now they're quite twisted tales, similar to Roald Dahl's Tales of the Unexpected, whom she's actually cited as an influence, or even Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber. The album is populated with female characters encountering supernatural and deadly situations. In Ophelia, Hackman takes on the perspective of the character from Hamlet, playing out what feels like her last moments before she decides to die. In Animal Fear, Hackman presents us with a werewolf. In Monday Afternoon, we have a decaying corpse or ghost. And in the opening track, Drown, we're presented with this slightly masochistic individual individual in a very intense relationship. But that's not to say that we don't hear from Hackman herself throughout the album. She seems to appear in a few different songs, telling us about songwriting and drawing parallels between the supernatural and the creative process. As in Claude's Girl, when she begs for respite from her buzzing mind. When I saw her perform, Hackman actually explained that that song was originally written as a lullaby for herself when she was suffering from insomnia, and it was inspired by Debussy's The Girl with the Flaxen Hair. I find the positioning of Claude's Girl at the end of the A-side really interesting, because it's almost like Hackman is popping up as an intermission and reminding us that she's the one channeling those other characters, and also the toll that that's taking on her. It's as if she's portraying herself as some kind of medium or oracle. As well as her storytelling, another defining characteristic of this album is Hackman's own Gothic fascination with death. What I mean by Gothic in this case is that Hackman is very interested in things that are taboo or outside of our normal society and structures. She uses a lot of visceral imagery. As I said, she talks about decomposing bodies, and she seems really interested in the corporeality of humans. What do I mean by that big word? Basically, corporeality just means like the bodiness, the humanness, that we are essentially in big sacks of flesh. And as much as we might have higher aspirations, we are essentially bounded by our own physical forms. And she seems very interested in the physical bits of us. For example, in the song Skin, which is basically quite a creepy love song, she sings about being jealous of her lover's neck, which she describes as that narrow porcelain plinth of flesh. And she wishes that she could support their head in her own hands instead, which is one of those parts of her music where it can kind of glide over and you don't quite think about it. And then you realize that's what a serial killer would say. It's like somebody wanting to chop off somebody's neck and then just hold their head in their hands because they just want to be near them all the time. Her music also has a morbid fascination with decomposition itself. This album actually reminded me a lot of Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, or The Flowers of Evil, which is a poetry collection in which Baudelaire seeks to write about subjects that are not necessarily that nice, but he makes them beautiful through his language. Because anybody can write about a sunset and make that beautiful. Like, everybody thinks that a sunset is beautiful, but to make something that is seen usually as ugly and to use language alone and poetry to make that seem beautiful is a real poetic skill, right? A perfect example of this is the poem Une Gironde, which means literally a rotting carcass. That poem is about a couple discovering a decomposing body, but the way that Baudelaire describes it, about how nature is coming to life through its decomposition, kind of makes the actual carcass not disgusting. It makes it kind of beautiful. And I find Hackman's song Monday Afternoon very similar to that poem. She's singing from the perspective of this decomposing body, but over this very gentle, beautiful acoustic guitar. One of the lines from that song that I think really exemplifies this is when she sings, "Lay on your back, breathe it in, the sickly sweet of my rotting skin." It's like those bits of her songs, it's like pretty until the last moment when you realize what it really means. That character of the decomposing body continues in the next song on the album, Undone Undress. She sings about birds eating her body, their blue beaks aching, although that song becomes more ominous at its end with the final verse, "I'll be here when you can't breathe, waiting patiently, silently," which suddenly put an even darker lens on this album for me, because it suggested that some of those dumped bodies that we saw in the artwork and some of these decomposing bodies that she's been singing about were murdered. And there's that hint of a vengeful ghost lurking, even by referencing the character Ophelia, who was almost driven to her death by the behavior of Hamlet in the play. It's like the idea of somebody being murdered either directly or indirectly. These are not accidental deaths, these are very preventable deaths. The macabre seems to have fascinated Hackman throughout her career. One of her earlier songs, Cannibal, from the That Iron Taste EP, is about eating other people, and even the title of that EP references the taste of blood. So it seems to be a running theme with her work. Although I did find some explanation for that on this album in the song Next Year. She sings, "Wholemeal and coal are better for the soul, but I believe in blood and lust." I think it's also interesting to note that this album was heavily inspired by Robert Frost's poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and particularly its final stanza, which is very famous and you'll probably recognize it. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." That poem and that stanza specifically are quite opaque, partially because of Frost's writing, which at face value can seem very simplistic but actually has a lot of layers underneath it. So some people have said that it refers mainly to travelling and that it's also about the pull of the wild and feeling outside of society. And then other people have said that it's about death, and specifically sort of contemplating death or suicide, but eventually deciding against it. It seems that Hackman has definitely taken the latter interpretation of the poem, and she said that this album and its title were directly inspired by Frost's poem. The title, "We Slept at Last," obviously refers back to the miles before asleep, i.e. finally reaching death. Hackman actually did a very cool thing for Spotify where she narrated each song on the album, and she revealed a lot of the information about how she produced the album, and it's really worth a listen if you are interested in that. She said that she was particularly drawn to the line, "The woods are lovely, dark and deep." I think because the woods themselves represent the unknown and things that are outside of society, things that are taboo from our usual everyday lives, and also those things that are not quite ordered. In fact, there's a lot of woodland imagery throughout this album and in the accompanying art booklet. It's as if this album is a journey through a forest, and we're seeing all these different people and creatures who inhabit the forest as we move through it with this traveller. Because although the songs are mainly separate stories, there is one recurring character who appears in the only two paired songs on the album, "Before I Sleep" and "Let Me In." Both of those songs are directly inspired by the Frost poem and act as bookends for the album. "Before I Sleep," which is the second track on the album, references the miles I have yet to tread, while in the final track, "Let Me In," one of the concluding lines is "We slept at last." Both songs feature this travelling character at different stages of her journey as she tries to find her way to some place, and at the end she does find that final resting place. And I think that metaphor of journeys and searching carries throughout the album, and in fact in every individual song there is that idea of searching desperately for something, with the final conclusion being that they find it. Overall, I think that this album is fantastic. It may be that I'm personally more inclined to those darker topics. I love how We Slept at Last explores the links between death and beauty, and I think that Marika Hackman is unique as an artist, so I'm going to give it 5 stars. I just have a feeling that she's going places and that everything that she's doing is so interesting and different. But should you get it on vinyl? Although I don't think that it's necessary to enjoy the music to listen to We Slept at Last on vinyl. I think that Marika Hackman has released a lot of things digitally, and she seems to be quite open to different formats. For the artwork alone, I think it's worth getting. I haven't seen these displayed or published anywhere else, and they're really interesting. And considering it's the same price as any other vinyl record, it's like the same amount for a book and a record and a digital copy. Pretty good value. Plus on the vinyl you get that analog warmth that really adds to Hackman's storytelling and acoustic aesthetic. Let me know what you think of We Slept at Last in the comments, or if you haven't listened to it yet, do you think you'll check it out? Next time I'm going to be looking at some Billie Holiday tracks in honour of what would have been her 100th birthday. After that I haven't decided yet what I'm going to be reviewing, and I'd love to know what you guys think. So I have 3 albums that I have on vinyl that I have a lot of thoughts on, and that I probably am going to review them all. There's Purity Rings, Another Eternity, Björk's Vulnicura, and Blur's Magic Whip. So if you can let me know in a comment below which one of those you would prefer to see first, and then I'll have a look and see what's most popular by the time I get to that video. And if you're not already and you'd like to know when those reviews and my other videos come out, then be sure to click subscribe. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!